The sun was just starting its climb over the horizon, burning off the chill of the pre-dawn air. On the outskirts of Dry Creek, the McAllister Ranch stretched like a patchwork quilt of sagebrush, dirt, and weathered fences. The land was honest, hard, and unforgiving, just like its owner, Jeb McAllister. He was a man who had inherited the ranch from his father, and though his hands were rough from decades of tending cattle and repairing fences, his heart carried a weight heavier than any workday under the scorching sun. Jeb had been a widower for 3 years, his heart quietly locked away behind stubborn pride and long nights spent talking to the wind. He moved through his mornings with a kind of mechanical precision, feeding the livestock, mending a fence post that had been knocked down by last night's windstorm, checking the water troughs. All the while, he avoided looking at the little cabin at the edge of the property, the one where a new cook had just arrived, a shy, quiet woman named Clara Hart. Clara wasn't like most who came to these parts. She had traveled far, carrying with her nothing but a small trunk and a notebook filled with recipes that smelled faintly of home. She was gentle but unpolished, her movements deliberate, her voice soft. Yet behind her quiet demeanor lay a spark of courage she had only recently discovered in herself. She'd heard of Jeb McAllister before she arrived, the brooding rancher whose heartbreak had become as famous in the county as his herd of cattle. That's why, when she knocked on his door that first evening to offer her services, she felt a mix of excitement and fear. "Mr. McAllister," she called softly, her hand still on the doorframe. Her voice wavered only slightly. Jeb turned from the fence he was repairing, his hat shading his eyes, but the lines of his jaw tightened when he saw her. "That's me," he said gruffly. "You, the cook?" "Yes, sir. Clara Hart. I can start right away." He studied her for a long moment, his gaze like the desert sun, blinding and relentless. "You sure about this, Miss Hart? It ain't much of a place for city folk." Clara's lips pressed together, and she gave a small nod. "I grew up in a small town. I can handle it." There was something about her persistence that caught him off guard. Most people came through Dry Creek for a paycheck or a night's lodging. She had come with a purpose, and he could sense it, but he still didn't smile. Not yet. That night, as Clara unpacked her trunk and arranged the kitchen of the McAllister cabin, she kept thinking about the man whose reputation preceded him. Heartbroken, solitary, unyielding, a man who had loved and lost. She had her own burdens too, but she didn't speak of them. Instead, she focused on the quiet rhythm of chopping vegetables, stirring soups, and learning the smell of the ranch. It was a life far removed from her own past, far removed from the city lights and the bustling streets she had left behind. And yet, there was a strange comfort in the raw simplicity of it all, the sound of horses lowing in the distance, the smell of hay and leather, the soft crunch of boots on dirt. By the time Jeb finally returned to the cabin for supper, the scent of roasting chicken had drifted out into the yard. He paused at the door, uncharacteristically hesitant. Clara glanced up from her work, a tentative smile playing on her lips. "You eat alone?" she asked, hoping her voice didn't betray too much nervousness. Jeb removed his hat and scratched the back of his neck. "Not usually," he muttered. He sat at the wooden table, his eyes flicking to the steaming plate in front of him. Clara sat across, hands folded neatly in her lap. There was a silence between them, not uncomfortable, but weighted. Two people who had known pain and solitude, now sharing the same table under a fading lantern light. "You cook good," he said finally, breaking the quiet. There was no warmth in his words, not yet, but there was acknowledgement. It was something, at least. Clara nodded, letting the corners of her mouth lift just a touch. She had decided, even before meeting him, that she would do what she could to bring a little light into this man's life, even if it was just for a night, or a week, or however long he would allow her to stay. Outside, the wind whispered through the sagebrush, carrying with it the scent of rain from the distant hills. Two solitary hearts, each scarred in their own way, were beginning to orbit the same quiet corner of the world, unaware of just how much the other would come to mean. And so the night fell on the McAllister ranch, the first of many. As Clara prepared her humble meal and Jeb silently measured the weight of the loneliness that had kept him company for far too long, somewhere between the dust and the stars, something fragile began to stir, something that neither of them could yet name, but both would come to recognize in time, the faint glimmer of hope. The next morning broke over the McAllister ranch with a pale, cold light. Clara was already in the kitchen before the sun had fully risen, stirring a pot of oatmeal over the small wood stove. The smell of coffee drifted from the kettle, mingling with the faint scent of horses and hay that seeped through the open window. Jeb appeared at the doorway, his hat in hand and his boots coated in the fine dust of the corral. He paused, observing her quietly, as if measuring her worth not with words, but with the steadiness of her hands and the calmness of her expression. "Morning," he said, voice low and hoarse from the chill. "Morning, Mr. McAllister," Clara replied, setting a bowl of oatmeal and a steaming mug of coffee on the table. She hesitated, then added, "You didn't have to get up so early. I just thought I'd get a head start." Jeb grunted, sliding into the chair across from her. "The ranch doesn't wait. Son, don't care if you're ready or not. Cattle need water. Fences need mending. You get used to it." Clara nodded, spooning oatmeal into her mouth. She didn't need him to tell her that. She'd grown up around work that left hands calloused and backs sore, and she recognized the same stubborn pride in Jeb's posture that her father had carried on the farm. Back home, they ate in silence for a while, the only sound the faint creak of the wooden floor and the occasional clink of spoon against bowl. Clara had 100 things she wanted to say, 100 questions she wanted to ask, but she held back. She could sense that Jeb had his walls. Tall and unyielding, as the cliffs to the north of Dry Creek, she would have to tread carefully. Finally, Jeb spoke, his voice quieter than usual, almost hesitant. "You ever lose someone?" Clara froze mid-spoonful, glancing at him. She could see the weight in his eyes, the rough edges softened by grief. "Yes," she said carefully, choosing her words. "A few years ago, it leaves a mark." Jeb nodded, staring down at his empty bowl. I know that, Mark." He paused, as if debating whether to continue. Then, almost too softly for her to hear, he added, "Her name was May. She died sudden. Never got to say goodbye." Clara's heart ached for him. She had imagined grief in books and heard it in stories, but here it was real and raw. She wanted to say something, anything, that might ease the weight he carried. But the right words were elusive. Instead, she reached quietly for the coffee pot and refilled his mug. "I am sorry," she said simply. "I can't imagine." Jeb looked up, meeting her gaze. There was a flicker of something gratitude, perhaps, or recognition. He grunted again, not in dismissal, but as if accepting a bridge extended toward him. "Don't need to imagine, just live with it?" The morning chores began shortly after. Clara followed Jeb to the corral, learning how to feed the cattle, mend a section of fence, and watch for signs of illness in the herd. Her hands were softer, her movements slower than his, but she had a steady determination. "You've got a gentle touch," Jeb commented when she guided a calf back toward its mother. "Not everyone can handle cattle without spooking them." Clara smiled faintly, feeling a small spark of pride. "I learned from the best." Back home, as the sun climbed higher, the dust swirled around them, and Clara began to notice the little things about Jeb. The way he paused before speaking, weighing his words, the subtle twitch of his jaw when he was frustrated, the quiet way he hummed an old tune when no one was listening, and beneath it all, the grief that never fully left him, though he carried it with the discipline of a man used to the harshness of life. By late afternoon, after the cattle were fed and the fences repaired, Clara found herself sitting on the porch, wiping sweat from her brow. Jeb joined her, settling into the chair beside hers. They were quiet again, but it was a companionable silence this time, one that spoke of mutual respect rather than distance. Clara felt a sudden surge of courage. "Mr. McAllister, I know this might sound strange, but I'd like to help, not just with the cooking, but with you, with the ranch, if you'll let me." Jeb's eyebrows lifted, and for the first time, he allowed a faint half-smile. "Ain't used to help coming like that," he said. "Most folks take, don't give." Clara met his gaze firmly. "I'm not most folks." There was a pause, long enough for the wind to carry the sound of distant cattle lowing across the valley. Jeb finally tipped his hat back and let out a slow, low whistle. "Well, Miss Hart, you might just be all right, but don't think this means I'm softening up." Clara laughed softly, the sound mingling with the wind. "I wouldn't dream of it." As the day faded into evening, there was a subtle shift in the air, of fragile connection beginning to form. Two lonely souls, scarred by loss, were starting to recognize each other's presence not as a threat or a burden, but as a small comfort. And though neither of them could have predicted it, that comfort was the first step toward something neither had dared to hope for, the possibility of healing. Outside, the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in strokes of orange and violet. For a brief moment, the ranch felt less like a place of solitude and more like a home, if only in the quiet understanding shared between a cook and a rancher, who had both known the ache of a heart left empty. The days at McAllister Ranch settled into a steady rhythm. Clara's presence had become a quiet comfort in the house. And even Jeb admitted, if only to himself, that the cabin felt a little less empty. Yet, like the land itself, life on the ranch was never entirely peaceful. One morning, as Clara swept the porch, dark clouds began to gather over the horizon. The wind shifted suddenly, carrying the scent of rain and the promise of trouble. Jeb rode up on his horse, eyes narrowing as he scanned the sky. "Storm's coming," he said, dismounting with a practiced ease. His voice held that low edge of warning he often reserved for things beyond his control. "We need to get the cattle secured." Clara nodded, quickly setting down the broom and gathering her apron. She followed him out into the yard, the clouds darkening above. The first few drops of rain fell, spattering the dry earth, and the wind picked up, whipping strands of hair across her face. Jeb moved with precision, directing her and the ranch hands who had come for the day's work. "Closer to the barn. Keep em calm. Don't let em panic." Clara had learned much about cattle in the past weeks, but storms were something different. Panic had a smell, the sharp, almost metallic scent of fear, and she felt it rising in the calves. She whispered softly, moving toward the smallest of the frightened animals. "It's all right. It's all right. You're safe," she murmured, her hands steady on its sides. Jeb noticed admiration flickering across his eyes, though he didn't say it. Instead, he shouted instructions over the wind, his voice commanding yet calm. By the time the storm hit in full force, the herd was secured, and the barn doors banged with the wind, but the cattle were mostly safe. After the worst had passed, the men returned to the house, mud and water tracking behind them. Clara set about making hot stew and bread, the smell filling the cabin and chasing away the damp chill. Jeb watched her from the doorway, noting how she moved with quiet efficiency, never faltering even when the storm had shaken the ranch to its core. "You handled the storm well," he said finally, sitting heavily at the table, still dripping from the rain. "Most folks would have run for cover." Clara shook her head, tugging a towel over her hair. "Running won't save the calves. I learned that a long time ago." There was a pause, long enough for the crackle of the fire to fill the silence. Jeb's gaze softened slightly, though the shadows of his grief remained. "You've got grit," he muttered. "Ain't easy to find." Clara smiled faintly, grateful but cautious. She sensed the storm outside, mirrored the storm in Jeb's heart, unspoken, unresolved, and dangerous in its own way. Yet the calm didn't last. That afternoon, a rider appeared on the ridge. Sheriff Dalton, a man known in Dry Creek for his bluntness. He dismounted quickly, mud clinging to his boots. "Jeb McAllister?" he asked, glancing past him at the cabin. "That's me," Jeb said warily. The sheriff's eyes softened, just slightly, but there was urgency in his voice. "We got troubled down by the creek. Some rustlers have been hitting nearby ranches. Thought you ought to know." Clara stiffened, glancing at Jeb. He exhaled slowly, running a hand across his face, his jaw tightening. This was the kind of challenge he had always faced, problems that came with the land, with neighbors, with life itself. Yet something about seeing Clara's concern made him pause. He didn't usually allow anyone to witness the gears turning in his mind. "I'll handle it," he said finally, voice low. "You stay inside, keep the fire warm and the food ready. If it comes to it, you'll be safe here." Clara's heart tightened at the firmness in his words. "Jeb, I can help," she said. "I know my place is not out there on the range, but I can do something, even if it's just keeping things running here while you go." He turned to her then, and for the first time in weeks, his eyes held something like vulnerability, not weakness, but acknowledgement. "You think you could manage?" Clara nodded, determination shining through her fear. "Yes, I can handle it." Jeb studied her for a long moment, then gave a slight nod, almost imperceptible. It was trust, the first real trust he had offered anyone in years. And though neither spoke of it, both knew that the storm outside was nothing compared to the storm of life and emotion that had begun to stir between them. The afternoon passed slowly. Jeb saddled his horse and rode toward the creek, disappearing into the dust and shadows. Clara watched him go, her heart tight, but also strangely light. For the first time, she felt like she wasn't just a guest or a cook on the ranch, she was part of its survival, part of its rhythm, part of Jeb's world in a way that mattered. The cabin was quiet after he left, but it wasn't lonely. Clara busied herself with mending clothes, cleaning the hearth, and preparing supper. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind, reminded her that life on the ranch was unpredictable, that danger could appear at any moment. But she also realized something else, that the strength she had been cultivating, quietly, in the past few weeks, wasn't just about survival. It was about connection, and in a life as harsh and unforgiving as the one they led, that connection, fragile, tense, and unspoken, was a rare and precious thing indeed. The night after the rustler warning, the McAllister ranch felt unusually still. The wind had died down, leaving a soft hush over the land, as if the earth itself were holding its breath. Clara stood by the window, staring out at the shadowed pastures where Jeb had ridden earlier, her mind restless. She could still feel the tension in his shoulders, the careful way he handled the reins, the way his eyes scanned the horizon as if expecting trouble at any moment. She had spent the evening preparing a late supper, the warm stew and fresh bread carrying the scent of home through the cabin. The fire crackled in the hearth, painting the room with dancing shadows. Normally, she could work quietly, her hands moving on autopilot while her thoughts wandered, but tonight was different. Every sound, the whistle of wind through the eaves, the distant lowing of the cattle made her heart beat a little faster. Jeb returned as dusk faded into a moonless night. His horse was tired, his coat streaked with mud and sweat, but he carried himself with the same rigid determination he always had. Clara greeted him quietly, offering the plate of stew and a mug of coffee. "Sit," she said softly, gesturing to the table. "Eat while it's hot." He hesitated, then removed his hat, shaking the wetness from his hair. He set it on the counter and sat heavily, rubbing his hands together to warm them. "Storm came sooner than I thought," he muttered. "Rustlers didn't show up though. Seems they moved on before I got there." Clara nodded, relief and apprehension mingling in her chest. "That's good, I guess, but it still worries me. You shouldn't have gone alone." Jeb gave a faint, almost imperceptible smirk. "A man's gotta protect what's his. Ain't many folks you can trust out here." She hesitated before replying, choosing her words carefully. "I trust you, Jeb, and I hope you know, I want to be part of it, not just cooking, but helping, if you let me." For a moment, he didn't speak. The firelight reflected in his eyes, showing glimpses of the man beneath the hard exterior, the grief, the loneliness, and now, a flicker of something else. Possibility. Finally, he spoke, his voice low. "You got guts, Clara." "Not everyone's got it. Most folks wouldn't stick around long enough to be part of it." Clara felt her heart skip. That was all the acknowledgement she needed for now. She set down the plate of stew and served him in silence, their movements measured, unhurried. For once, the cabin felt more like a home than a workplace. Later, after the meal, Clara busied herself with cleaning the dishes. Jeb lingered by the fire, staring into the flames, lost in thought. She watched him for a moment before quietly speaking. "Do you ever think about moving on?" she asked softly. He didn't look up. "A man don't just move on from loss. Not the way folks think. You learn to live with it. You find ways to keep going, that's all." Clara's hands stilled on the dish towel. She knew he was right, but she also understood something deeper. Jeb's walls weren't just about protecting himself, they were about protecting the memory of May, the woman he had loved and lost. And somehow, through her presence, through the quiet care she offered every day, he was beginning to consider that maybe, just maybe, life could hold room for something or someone new. A sudden noise outside startled them both. Clara glanced toward the window, heart racing, but Jeb's calm hand on her shoulder steadied her. "Probably just the wind," he said, his voice gentle. His thumb brushed against hers, a subtle but intentional touch that made her pulse quicken. The silence returned, heavy but no longer oppressive. Clara felt a warmth she hadn't expected, not just from the fire, but from the connection slowly building between them. It was tentative, fragile, but undeniable. Two hearts, both scarred, learning to trust again. Jeb finally stood, moving toward the door. "Get some rest," he said. "We got another long day tomorrow. Work don't wait, and neither do the cattle." Clara nodded, but she lingered at the window a moment longer, watching him ride off into the darkened pastures. Something about the sight stirred a feeling she hadn't named yet. Hope, perhaps, or maybe the first hint of love. As she prepared for bed, she thought about the life she had left behind and the life she was beginning to carve out here. Among dust, cattle, and quiet courage. She had no illusions. Life on a ranch was hard, and Jeb McAllister was not an easy man to reach, but she felt, deep in her bones, that whatever lay ahead, she wanted to face it here, with him, and somewhere in the night, as the wind whispered through the trees and the stars began to pierce the darkness, two hearts wounded, wary, but resilient, kept turning toward each other, inch by inch, day by day, guided by the slow, steady rhythm of life on the McAllister ranch. The following week carried the stillness of routine, but under its calm lay a tension neither Clara nor Jeb could ignore. Work on the ranch was unceasing. Fences needed mending, water troughs had to be refilled, and the cattle demanded constant attention, but even the rhythm of labor couldn't drown out the quiet unease that had settled over the cabin. Clara had begun to feel at home in the kitchen. her hands steady as she prepared meals and tended to the small garden behind the house. Yet, a letter from back home, which she had tucked away in her apron, gnawed at her conscience. She hadn't opened it until that evening, but now, sitting by the fire with her mind elsewhere, she finally did. The handwriting was unmistakable, her father's, but the words, though meant to be comforting, struck like a cold wind. "Clara, we need you back. Your mother's health is failing. Come home if you can. Don't delay." Clara's heart sank. She loved the McAllister ranch, loved the slow, steady companionship she had found with Jeb, but the pull of family responsibility was strong. She folded the letter carefully, hiding it from view. She didn't know how to tell Jeb, or if she should. Not yet. The next morning, while Jeb tended the western pastures, Clara's thoughts kept returning to the letter. She worked silently, chopping vegetables, her hands moving mechanically while her mind wrestled with the decision she dreaded. Jeb noticed her distraction as he entered the cabin for lunch. He set his hat down with a tired sigh. "You've been quiet all morning," he said, eyeing her closely. "Something on your mind?" Clara hesitated, stirring the stew absent-mindedly. She wanted to share the truth, but the thought of leaving him, of upsetting the fragile trust they had built, made her pause. "Just tired," she replied, forcing a small smile. Jeb didn't push further, but his eyes lingered on her, perceptive and patient. "You know, Clara, you can tell me anything. Ain't a shame in leaning on someone?" Her throat tightened. Leaning on him felt right, but the weight of the letter made her hesitate. She nodded silently, hoping he wouldn't press the matter. That evening, a stranger arrived on horseback, a wiry man named Tom, claiming to have known Jeb years ago. His manner was brash, his voice carrying a teasing familiarity that unsettled Clara. "Jeb McAllister. Still running this spread all on your own?" Tom called, dismounting roughly. "You need a hand, or are you planning to do it all yourself?" Jeb's jaw tightened, but he greeted the man with cautious civility. "Tom, been a long time. What brings you here?" Tom smirked. "Just checking in. Heard about the rustlers. Figured I'd see how the McAllister place was holding up." Clara felt a twinge of unease. There was something in Tom's gaze and appraisal, a subtle challenge that made her instinctively step closer to Jeb. He noticed her movement and placed a protective hand near hers. Not touching, just near enough to send a quiet message. "I've got this." The evening passed tensely, with Tom's teasing remarks lingering in the air like dust. He subtly questioned Jeb's management of the ranch, hinting that he might not be fit to run it alone. Jeb's silence and controlled responses only made Clara more aware of the invisible wall he maintained, one built from past losses and grudges. After Tom rode off, the tension finally cracked. Clara approached Jeb, the firelight reflecting her worry. He didn't mean well," she said softly. Jeb exhaled heavily, running a hand through his hair. "A man like him? Always testing. He wants to see cracks. Don't let it bother you." But it did. Clara realized how fragile their trust could be. How easy it was for shadows of the past, whether grief, rivalries, or obligations, to seep into the present. She wanted to shield him, to be part of the fight, yet she was painfully aware of her own ties back home. Sitting together in the quiet after dinner, Clara felt the weight of the letter pressing down on her. She could no longer keep it hidden without feeling like a betrayer. Swallowing her fear, she finally spoke. "Jeb, there's something I need to tell you." He looked up, attentive but wary. "Go on." Clara took a deep breath. "My mother. She's sick. My family. They need me back home. I don't know when, or if I should leave, but I couldn't stay silent anymore." Jeb's face darkened, not with anger, but with the mix of understanding and hurt that comes from a man who had built his life on control and routine. "Clara, I don't know what to say. You've done so much here. You've made a difference. And he paused, searching for words. "You need to do what's right for your family." Tears welled in Clara's eyes. "I don't want to leave. Not like this. Not if it means leaving you." Jeb's hand hovered near hers, then rested lightly on the table, bridging the distance between them without forcing it. "We'll figure it out. You got obligations, and I got mine. But you've got a place here too. Clara, don't ever forget that." In that small, quiet gesture, Clara felt a fragile but undeniable thread forming between them, a connection that neither time, distance, nor circumstance could easily sever. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying the scent of distant rain and the promise of change. Inside, two hearts wrestled with duty and desire, learning that sometimes love meant standing together even when life threatened to pull them apart. The week after, Clara's confession brought an uneasy calm to McAllister Ranch. the skies were clear, and the pastures glistened with morning dew, but the tension in the cabin lingered like smoke after a fire. Clara had resumed her work with steady hands, but her thoughts often drifted back to her mother's letter and Jeb's quiet, understanding words. It was mid-afternoon when the alarm came, not in the form of a letter or visitor, but in the unmistakable roar of a brush fire at the edge of the southern pasture. Smoke rose like a dark, living thing, curling toward the sky and streaking the horizon with orange light. Jeb spotted it first, riding hard along the ridge, hat pressed tightly to his head. Fire! South pasture cattle might be trapped, he shouted to the ranch hands who had gathered at the sound. Clara's heart slammed against her chest. She had never fought a fire of this size, but she didn't hesitate. Grabbing a bucket and tossing on her coat, she ran to the barn, where water barrels and equipment waited. She met Jeb at the edge of the pasture, the heat already blistering the air. "Clara?" he called over the roar of flames. "Stay close, keep the calves calm, help me drive the herd to the north field. Quick!" Her hands shook slightly, but determination steadied her. "I'm ready," she said. They moved together, a team honed by weeks of quiet trust and shared effort. Jeb's voice directed the cattle, low and steady, while Clara moved through the smaller animals, coaxing them forward with soft words and gentle pressure. The fire crackled dangerously close, smoke stinging her eyes. But she didn't falter. For a moment, a calf panicked and bolted toward the flames. Clara lunged, catching it under the chest and steering it back toward the open field. Jeb saw her struggle and quickly galloped over, helping guide the animal safely away from danger. Their hands brushed, fingers gripping the calf together, and for a fleeting second, time slowed. "Got it," Jeb muttered, his chest heaving from exertion and the heat. Clara nodded, breathing heavily, but there was no time to linger. The fire advanced faster than they anticipated, and the herd had to be driven with urgency. They worked side by side, shouting, urging, and sometimes physically guiding the cattle, their coordination seamless despite the chaos. After what felt like hours, the herd finally reached the northern fields, away from the fire's hungry reach. Smoke hung thick in the air, but the danger had passed for now. Clara collapsed onto a fence rail, gasping, while Jeb stood nearby, surveying the damage. His coat was scorched in places, and sweat streaked his dirt-smudged face. "You all right?" he asked, his voice softer than it had been all afternoon. Clara nodded, her throat raw and eyes wide. I think so. We saved most of them." Jeb came to sit beside her on the rail, the heat of the fire replaced by the warmth of shared relief. "You were incredible," he said quietly. "I couldn't have done it without you." Clara's gaze fell to the ground, a mix of pride and embarrassment washing over her. "We did it together," she said. For a long moment, they sat in silence. The fire reduced to smoldering edges, the cattle grazing cautiously in the safe fields beyond. The adrenaline still thrummed through their veins, but now it carried something more subtle, an unspoken understanding of each other's strengths, courage, and dedication. Finally, Jeb's hand brushed against hers, tentative but deliberate. Clara didn't pull away. He began, then stopped, words failing him in the quiet aftermath. "I know," she said softly, understanding perfectly. "We work better together." His lips curved in a rare, fleeting smile, one that carried both relief and affection. "Yeah, better together." That night, in the cabin warmed by the fire Clara had kept alive, the danger outside transformed into closeness inside. They shared a simple meal, hands occasionally brushing, eyes meeting with a new intensity. Every glance, every touch, seemed to acknowledge what neither had said aloud, that they were no longer just rancher and cook, no longer just caretaker and helper. They were partners, bound by shared trials, mutual trust, and a deepening, quiet affection. Clara knew the road ahead was uncertain. Her family still called to her, and the ranch would always demand strength, but for the first time, she felt she could face it all with Jeb by her side. And Jeb, for his part, felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years, the stirring hope that life, even with its hardships, could still hold happiness and love worth protecting. Outside, the stars shimmered above the McAllister ranch, serene and distant, as if witnessing the small victories, the sparks of courage, and the quiet beginnings of something neither of them had expected, but both had silently hoped for. The morning after the fire dawned, crisp and clear, the air carrying the scent of scorched grass and freshly turned earth. The McAllister ranch had suffered damage, but thanks to quick thinking, hard work, and teamwork, the worst had been avoided. Jeb and Clara walked the perimeters, checking fences, assessing the pastures, and quietly marveling at the resilience of both the land and themselves. Clara's thoughts, however, kept drifting back to the letter from home. Her mother's illness weighed heavily on her, a persistent tug she could no longer ignore. She had wrestled with the decision for days, torn between duty to her family and loyalty to the ranch and, more quietly, her growing feelings for Jeb. As they returned to the cabin, Clara took a deep breath. "Jeb," she began, hesitating as she caught sight of him moving supplies from the barn. He looked up, eyes alert, waiting for her words. "I got a letter from my father," she said finally. "My mother, she's sick. I need to go back home for a while." Jeb's expression was unreadable for a moment, the sunlight highlighting the lines of fatigue and determination on his face. Then, slowly, he nodded. "I thought this might come," he said quietly. "Family, that's important. You can't ignore it." Clara's chest tightened. "I don't want to leave you or the ranch, but I have to do this." Jeb walked closer, stopping just a few feet away. His voice was gentle, yet carried the weight of unspoken emotions. "Clara, this place, it's yours as much as it is mine. You helped me hold it together when I couldn't do it alone, and I've come to care about you, but I won't hold you back from what you need to do." Tears welled in Clara's eyes. "I care about you too, Jeb, more than I expected, more than I ever thought I could." He reached out, brushing her hand with his thumb. It was a small gesture, quiet but full of meaning, a promise that distance wouldn't erase what had grown between them. "Then we'll make this work. You go home, see your family, and we'll see each other again. I'll be here, and this ranch will be here, waiting." Clara nodded, relief mingling with sorrow. She knew leaving was the right choice, yet it felt like stepping away from a life she had just begun to embrace. The following days were a flurry of preparation. Clara packed carefully, making sure to leave the cabin as orderly as possible. She checked on the cattle one last time, walked the pastures, and even tended the garden she had started. Every step reminded her of the life she was temporarily leaving behind, and the man who had become unexpectedly central to it. On the morning of her departure, Jeb rode alongside her as she loaded her horse. The horizon glowed with the soft light of dawn, painting the pastures in gold and amber. "Promise me something," Jeb said quietly. "What?" Clara asked, tightening her grip on the reins. "Promise me you'll come back when your family's settled. This place and I will wait. Ain't nothing worth losing what we got here." Clara nodded, her throat tight with emotion. "I promise." He gave her a faint, reassuring smile. "Good, and Clara, don't forget, you're braver than you know." As she rode away, the wind whipping through her hair, Clara felt a mixture of sorrow and hope. She was leaving, yes, but she carried with her the lessons of the ranch, the fire they had survived, and the connection she and Jeb had built. It was strong enough to withstand distance, patient enough to wait until the right moment. Jeb watched her disappear over the ridge, heart heavy but resolute. Life on the ranch would continue, and he knew Clara's spirit would endure. And when she returned, he would be waiting not just for a partner, but for someone who had proven that love, like the land they tended, could survive hardship, storms, and time. In the weeks that followed, Clara settled with her family, caring for her mother and fulfilling her obligations. Yet every thought of home carried the McAllister ranch with it, the smell of fresh-cut hay, the warmth of the kitchen, and the steady, enduring presence of Jeb. She wrote letters, sent updates, and held on to the promise that distance couldn't diminish what had begun between them. And back on the ranch, Jeb worked through the seasons, each sunrise reminding him that life could be hard, unyielding, and unpredictable. But it also reminded him of Clara, the brave cook who had saved cattle, calmed storms, and, without even knowing it, rekindled a hope he had thought lost forever. They were apart, yes, but their hearts remained tethered across the miles. And in that tether, there was patience, there was trust, and there was love ready to bloom fully when the day came that Clara would return to the McAllister ranch. And to him, for good.